Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Tristan Guyette. I am Beyond the Bombs campaign director. And tonight we are joined by Louis Reckford and our partnerships manager, Yasmin Silva. Tonight we'll be talking about the budget, a ridiculous amount of money that we spend every single year. If you're watching us live on Facebook, feel free to drop your questions on Facebook. We have someone monitoring that, and we'll be getting to as many questions as we can at the end of this. So before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have somehow managed to avoid being on a whole bunch of Zoom calls in the past year, just a couple of notes. I do encourage everybody to use the chat. Make sure that you change the option from panelists to panelists and attendees so that everybody else can read your thoughts as well. If you want to ask a question, there's a button at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. So that's where we'll be looking when we get to the end of this, when we're taking questions from everybody in the audience. Like I said, we are live streaming on Facebook, and I do see people introducing themselves in the chat, so definitely keep that up and we'll get rolling. Like I said, my name is Tristan Guyette. I use they, them pronouns, and I am Beyond the Bombs campaign director. If you want to follow up with me after this, because we would love to get you involved, make you a member of the bomb squad, get you involved in campaigns a little bit more, you can email me at tristan@beyondthebomb.org or find me on Twitter at trisintoledo. Louis, would you like to, hold on. Louis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for joining this evening, and thank you to Beyond the Bomb for hosting me. My name is Louis Reckford, and I'm currently the policy advisor at Foreign Policy for America, working on the Iran, North Korea, and nuclear nonproliferation and arms control portfolio. And prior to that, I spent 5 years on Capitol Hill working for Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon. He was on both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senate Appropriations Committee, which is the reason why I am speaking to you about the budget and appropriations process tonight.
Awesome, thank you so much. So before Louis gives us a really wonderful overview of this process, I want to talk a little bit about why we're talking about this in the first place. And the easiest way to put it is that budgets are moral documents. And that's not something that we automatically think of, right? But budgets highlight our priorities. And when we look at how much we spend on things like the military and defense and weapons, it really highlights how misplaced our priorities as a nation are. And I'll get a little bit more into what some of those numbers look like in a minute. But I have a question for everybody. And I get the sense that if you're on this call, we're probably all going to agree. But according to the Brookings Institute, if we forgave all federal loan debt, it would cost about $1.6 trillion. That is roughly what we are going to spend over the next couple of decades modernizing our nuclear triad. So go ahead and throw it in the chat if you'd like to weigh in. Would you rather cancel all student loan debt or modernize our nuclear triad? I feel like we probably all agree the nuclear weapons are less important. A couple of other really interesting things that I like to point out. So another estimate is to fix Flint, Michigan's water system. And I am from Toledo, Ohio, so I am just a little bit south of Flint, Michigan. Those estimates range from $55 million to $216 million. Regardless, modernizing our ground-based strategic defense system, those are the weapons that are in silos in the United States, that's going to cost roughly $264 million over the course of its lifetime. I personally feel like the lives in Flint are a little bit more important. Lastly, the Pentagon is getting ready to spend about $9 billion over the next decade producing sea-launched cruise missiles, or SLCMs. And if you want to learn more about those, we just posted a great blog post on our website, beyondthebomb.org, called The Pentagon's $9 billion Slick 'em Up. So I definitely recommend checking that out. But instead of producing those nuclear weapons that were retired over a decade ago under Obama, we could hire over 11,000 more school teachers for that same decade. So those numbers came from nationalpriorities.org, which is a great resource. You can check them out. They have a cool tool where you can kind of see what we could move money into. So if you wanted to pay for COVID vaccines or Medicare, things like that. Super cool. And that's also where this next slide comes from. So this is from 2015. These percentages stay roughly the same though. And something to point out is that we have two types of spending. We have mandatory and discretionary funding. So mandatory are things like Social Security, Medicare. Military, however, is considered discretionary spending. So within that discretionary spending, the military takes up the biggest chunk. Things like science is the tiniest little sliver in there, energy and the environment, all of these things take a back seat to what we are spending on the military. Once again, that takes me kind of back to my point that our federal budget is a statement of our national values. And this was summed up so well in a letter that was sent to President Biden recently by Representatives Barbara Lee, who, if you remember, is one of the only people, or is the only person, who voted against the authorization of use of military force after 9/11. So it was started by Barbara Lee, Representatives Pocan and Auchincloss. And I cannot remember exactly how many representatives signed on before it went to Biden's office. I do believe it was over 50 though. But their point is that in his first budget request, he has an opportunity to undo the damage of the last 4 years. So we can start that by cutting programs like the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile program that Trump wanted to revive from the dead. We don't necessarily need to modernize those ground-based strategic defense systems. And luckily, there are things that we can do about this. So after this webinar, check out our website, beyondthebomb.org, go to campaigns, and you can send a letter to your representatives tonight asking them to cancel the funding for both of those programs. And I think that's it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Louis to get started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tristan. And as I said before, thank you so much for hosting me and allowing me to share my experience on Capitol Hill. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to explain some of the mystery around Congress and especially around the appropriations process, because it's kind of hard to navigate for constituents and grassroots folks who don't have the background or funding to be able to do so. And so my hope is that I can just offer an inside view of how the appropriations process works from the congressional staff perspective, and hopefully that'll allow grassroots advocates like yourself to better influence how federal dollars are spent. And first, I'd like to just touch on a couple of definitions and jargony terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation. I realize a lot of these are very DC centric, so apologize in advance if it gets a little confusing or wonky. And if I start using any terms that are unfamiliar or not covered in this section, let me know. Please drop questions in the chat or ask afterwards if I can clarify anything that might be unclear. I'm going to try and keep it as unjargony and unconfusing as possible by avoiding some of the technical and legal requirements of the process, and simply just give an overview of the process from a nuts and bolts perspective. But please, don't hesitate to ask if I stray from that. So appropriations. Simply put, appropriations bills are spending bills. These bills direct where federal discretionary spending, meaning not mandatory spending on entitlements like Medicare and Medicaid, goes, which means every federal program from housing to farming to transportation to, yes, nuclear weapons goes through this process. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. The appropriations process is the realization of that power. It's one of Congress's most important roles, and this is where Congress derives a lot of its power. For example, it can choose not to fund a president's initiative, essentially acting as a check on presidential authority. Also, since very few meaningful bills get passed these days, appropriations bills have taken on an even greater importance, with a lot of times unrelated legislative priorities getting loaded into bills known as policy riders. More on this in a little. And since they're considered must pass in order to fund the government, that's why they're so important, and so many policy priorities get loaded up in it. The next thing I want to just touch on are member request letters. I'm going to be talking about a lot of different types of letters. Congress loves letters, so I want to make sure it's not too confusing. Every member of Congress is allowed to submit a letter to the Appropriations Committee with their appropriations requests for each subcommittee. These letters have individual requests that can range from, requesting amounts for the entire departments, like State Department funding, all the way down to specific funding for, smaller programs or report language. Requests are ordered by priority, and these letters are not public. These are private letters sent to the committee by congressional staff. And I'll go into more detail on these later. The president's budget. While the president's budget is influential and provides guidance while also showing what a presidential administration's priorities and values are, the president's budget actually has no legal authority. It's really just a political document and guide for Congress, despite the hoopla and media attention that always comes with it. Just as an example, Trump, repeatedly requested draconian cuts to every department and agency except for the Pentagon, and every time it got overwhelmingly and resoundingly rejected. I remember when I was staffing a hearing, Lindsey Graham, of all people, was lecturing Rex Tillerson during a State Department budget hearing about how the proposed cuts stood no chance of passing. Authorization. And so I just wanted to cover this briefly to differentiate between the National Defense Authorization Act, which is often referred to as the defense budget, and appropriations bills. Authorization bills simply provide the legal authority to fund programs up to a certain limit, but not over. And appropriations and spending bills must not exceed the legal authority that authorization bills provide. The NDA is extremely important for national security and nuclear weapons policy, because where policy directives and top line budget authority comes from, but not where the actual dollars come from. Allocation. This is the technical term for the amount of funding committees get to divvy up for each program. The full committee receives a 302A allocation, and subcommittees receive 302Bs. And these refer to the section of the budget statute that governs the budget process. If you ever hear, have the subcommittee receive their 302Bs, this is what they're referring to. The timing of the committee receiving these allocations are important for a bunch of technical reasons that are not especially important for our purposes today, so I'll spare everyone from trying to explain it. Policy riders. As I mentioned before, policy riders have become a point of contention in Congress, and this refers to non-spending policy provisions that often get added to appropriations bills. These usually come in the form of no funds may be used to carry out X, and these provisions, which are usually offered as amendments in committee or on the floor, can be referred to poison pills because their inclusion can lead to enough opposition from one party or the other to oppose the bill, which disrupts their chance of passage, and if things go really poorly, can ultimately risk a government shutdown. In recent years, Appropriations Committee leadership has made some informal agreements about prohibiting policy riders to make sure the appropriations process goes smoothly. However, these agreements usually fell apart due to opposition to certain Trump administration policies. In particular, the funding for the border wall really disrupted the process in recent years. Now, I just want to flag one more, earmarks. We won't get into these today, but during the many conversations I'm sure you are having about the appropriations process, you may hear the term earmark, which is also known as pork barrel spending. This is the colloquial term for federally directed spending, which is a practice of directing federal spending for specific projects. In the early Obama years, Congress got rid of earmarks as a way to reduce perception of corruption and excessive federal spending. But earmarks are making a comeback. For the first time in over a decade, earmarks are allowed this year with the hope of making the appropriations process run smoother. The theory is, even if members of Congress don't like overall spending levels or certain policy provisions, there are enough earmarks for their district or state. It makes it hard for them to oppose the bill. And finally, I just wanted to share all 12 of the appropriations subcommittees for your general awareness. For the purposes of our conversation, nuclear weapons come under the jurisdiction of the Defense and Energy and Water appropriations subcommittees. But these are the subcommittees that cover every single program in the federal government. And just before diving into how advocates can play a role in the process, I want to give a general overview of the process and how Congress, the Appropriations Committee, and individual member offices generally engage with the process. I'll dive into details of different aspects after I give the overview and touch on how it sort of played out more recently. I should also just note that these are from my experience in the Senate, and that the House process might be a little bit different. If you want a more detailed look at the process and some of the, where the authority and sort of legal requirements come from, there's a good reading from the Congressional Research Service on the appropriations process, but it's pretty dense and not, particularly interesting. So the budget process and the appropriations process kicks off no later than the first Monday of February. The president's budget request is statutorily required to be released by this date, though it often slips past this deadline, as it has this year. The president's budget main role for the appropriations process is that it's the basis from which members of Congress submit their appropriations requests. Member requests are usually formatted as a change from the president's budget. After this, Congress passes a budget that sets the spending limits, which usually happens by April 15th, but not always. And importantly, the congressional budget does not carry the force of law, but provides the budget guidance for each chamber and outlines the sort of allocations, the 302As and 302Bs that I mentioned earlier. And then from the release of the president's budget through appropriations subcommittee member request letter deadlines, which is usually in mid-April, is the term that is known as appropriations season. During this time, congressional staff collect requests and take meetings with constituents and stakeholders regarding their appropriations requests. During non-COVID times, this is like the craziest period of the year. And this is when a lot of organizations and trade associations have their conferences and fly-ins so that constituents can meet with their members of Congress and their staff and make their requests in person. And generally, offices have appropriations request intake forms in which constituents and stakeholders are able to fill out the details of their request and sort of make that request official. So after the member request letter is submitted, but prior to the subcommittee and committee markups, and this period is usually mid-April to mid-May, After the subcommittee receives the request letters and its 302B allocation, they start writing the bills. It's a very opaque process that even staff in offices don't have a lot of visibility into. But during this time, subcommittee staff may reach out to other congressional staff asking for clarification on certain requests. And also if offices show enough interest and following up on certain requests, like pinging subcommittee staff, asking what the status of the request is, or just being generally annoying, the subcommittee staff may be more willing to include it just to kind of get the office off their back. Depending on the subcommittee, they may also request a meeting with the member staff to discuss the letter request in more detail. This is also a point at which members may send dear colleague letters to subcommittee chairs and ranking members to try and show that there's a certain amount of support for a specific request by getting a large number of signers on that dear colleague letter. A dear colleague letter is when offices send around a letter that begins with dear colleague that asks other offices to sign on to a letter or a bill. In this case, it would just be a letter to show that there's a broad congressional support for their request or their position. You may have heard about dear colleagues from other advocacy efforts, and these are similar in their goals, which is just to show that there's as much public support for a provision or an issue as possible. Once the bills have been written by subcommittee staff, the bills are then published, and subcommittee markups are scheduled. Subcommittee markups are now generally just sort of a pro forma exercise where the chairs and the ranking members of the subcommittee give remarks about how well the process played out, and then the bill goes to full committee without amendments or significant debate. But then the full committee is where the action happens for amendments. This is where members get to offer amendments on their issues that they really care about. But unfortunately, this is also when the poison pill amendments often get added and can derail the process. So depending on the chamber, depending on the sort of committee leadership, they may try and narrow the amendment process and try and keep it a little bit managed, and so nothing unexpected happens. Generally, it is possible, theoretically, to get members to offer amendments, but the barrier to pass these amendments can be pretty high, just given the composition of the committees, and like I said, there may be agreements about policy riders, so not as many amendments get votes. After the bills are passed out of committee, the spending bills go to the floor for the full chamber's consideration. This is an opportunity for members who do not sit on the appropriations committee to offer amendments on the issues they care about. Recently, it's very rare for the Senate to consider amendments on the floor, but in the House, there's typically a pretty robust amendment process where hundreds of amendments can get votes or be considered. And in particular, on nuclear-related issues, we've seen quite a few nuclear amendments on appropriations bills on the House side, and so that's another thing to keep in mind. And then after each chamber passes their bills, a conference committee happens over August recess, and this is when the appropriations committees from each chamber meet and sort of hammer out the details and try and resolve differences. The committees will only negotiate on issues where there are discrepancies in the bill. So if each chamber passes the same budget number, those aren't going to be discussed. But when it comes to report language or bill language, or there is a big discrepancy in the budget number, those are when there will be some negotiations. And this is another time when members are able to weigh in through the Dear Colleagues to show support for language or budget number in one of the past bills. And then if everything goes according to schedule and there's enough cooperation and there haven't been policy riders, all 12 appropriations bills will be passed and signed into law before September 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. Recently, that has not been the case. In the Senate in particular, the process usually kicks off, when in the same time with appropriation season, release of the president's budget. And then usually up until the subcommittees begin to work on their bill, everything goes according to plan, and then everything can fall apart, either due to delays in the budget negotiations, or if there are policy differences on, poison pill or policy riders that are nearly irreconcilable, like border wall funding. And so, all of that to say, the Senate is particularly dysfunctional. And last year, the Senate did not pass any of the 12 appropriations bills prior to the end of the fiscal year. The House, on the other hand, was able to pass all of its bills on time prior to the end of the fiscal year. But one House passing the budget or passing the appropriations bills doesn't sign it into law. So last year there was a continuing resolution, which is sort of the stopgap funding measure. So before we sort of get into how how advocates can play a role, I just want to touch on why the member appropriations request letters are so important. Every member of Congress is able to submit a letter to each appropriations committee that details the appropriations requests. These are written in order of priority, with the first request being the most important to that member and the last request being the least important, though, if a request makes it into a letter, it does signify a certain, amount of importance to the member. But this is the initial way that members are able to advocate for their priorities in the appropriations process and spending bills. These requests can either be funding levels or what is known as bill language or report language. And if anyone's interested, I can go into details of that after I'm done with my presentation. But importantly, these are private documents and are not public. And so, and the reason why these are so important is because they form the basis from which the appropriations committee staff actually write the bills. And, building off of that, I also think it would be helpful to, explain how the appropriations committee drafts their bills in order to better understand the best ways to use the limited, resources available to influence the process. While every member is allowed to submit appropriations requests, the appropriations committee staff will weigh requests from appropriations committee members greater than members who are not. And further, members who sit on subcommittees of jurisdiction are given even greater weight to their requests than appropriations committee members who do not sit on those subcommittees. So for example, a member who sits on the transportation subcommittee, but not the defense subcommittee, will have greater influence when it comes to infrastructure funding than they will when it comes to specific defense funding. Also, members who sit on subcommittees tend to care more about those issues than other issues. And this means, two main things for the purposes of cutting the defense and nuclear weapons budget. Members who sit on the defense and energy and water subcommittees are more important when it comes to the outreach, but they're also more inclined to support the status quo because of just their historical, relationships to those issues. But this is what really makes grassroots outreach and advocacy around appropriations so important, because they need to be hearing differing views than what they typically do. And now I want to sort of get into how advocates can play a role at different points in the process and where grassroots action can provide some helpful nudges. Um, so appropriation season. As I mentioned, this is really the first point in the process where it is possible to influence spending bills. Having meetings and discussing appropriations requests with offices serves a couple of purposes. It socializes the idea of your appropriations request and signals that there's constituent interest in certain issues. If you are able to get a commitment that a member of Congress will submit your request, that should be considered a huge victory. By getting members of Congress to include your request, this signals to the Appropriations Committee that there's legitimate interest in the issue. However, just because a member includes a request does not mean that it'll be accepted by the committee. And also, it's pretty rare that a member's staff will tell you if they do include your request. The sort of post subcommittee deadline pre-markup is, where the dear colleague process can play out. And this is, another point where where it's possible to influence the bills. If there's an opportunity to send to sort of generate pressure and interest on members of Congress to sign a certain dear colleague letter, then that'll increase the number of members who are showing support for the issue. And so there should be an opportunity to sort of activate at that point. And the full committee markups, that, when it comes to drafting and writing amendments, advocates from the, advocacy community, a lot of time work with some of the more friendly offices to their issues to draft amendments on specific issues. At that point, folks will try and figure out how many, if the amendment has a chance to pass, which is known as whipping votes. And, at that point, if, members are, member staff are communicating to advocates, hey, we think this member is susceptible or is likely to vote with us, but we need to generate some pressure on them to do so. That's a chance for grassroots advocacy to really make a difference. However, the committee markups can be very, very hectic, and staff and even members easily get confused during the process. And timing, it can be, very late into the night. There might be a surprise vote. So it's hard to, organize and effectively advocate during this time. When it comes to the full chamber consideration, where there's even more amendments, this is a better opportunity to organize around, in my opinion, just because there are, the amendments get published publicly, and there's usually some notice around when if or when an amendment will get a vote. And so once again, that's an opportunity to organize and sort of generate, outreach to congressional offices saying, we support or we oppose this amendment to the appropriations bill. One thing though, is that even if there is an amendment that, you support and have done outreach on, it doesn't always necessarily mean that the vote is again, or that the amendment is going to get a vote. And then finally, during the conference committee time period, that's another opportunity to sort of organize around the dear colleague letters that I mentioned previously, to sort of to show that there's support for provisions. So that's the general overview when it comes to how advocates can play a role in the appropriations process. And I just want to sort of give a general thought and note about the appropriations requests in the process from a former staffer. My experience receiving appropriations requests and taking meetings from organizations and individuals led me to a couple conclusions. First, companies and organizations that have lobbyists dedicated to navigating the appropriations process inevitably have an upper hand when it comes to successfully winning their requests. These companies, oftentimes rely on federal funding for their operations. And since the amount of money can be so significant, it is cost effective for them to deploy, those resources to hire the people necessary to get that funding. The reason I mentioned this is because the defense budget is a prime area for these well-resourced lobbyists and companies to be especially active. Because these companies have facilities in just about every state and every district, these lobbyists represent, constituent interests, which gives them a natural in to congressional offices. I raise this because congressional offices are more likely to listen to and include appropriations requests from companies or organizations representing constituent interests. And this is where the grassroots advocacy can be an important counterweight to those interests. If congressional offices on subcommittees of jurisdiction are only hearing from companies with self-interest in a request, then they'll be inclined to include it unless they hear dissenting views from other constituent groups. And so one of the biggest factors when submitting appropriations requests is to make sure you are doing so for an office that you are a constituent of. While there definitely is value in offices seeing the same requests from a number of different individuals, regardless of if you're a constituent or not, there's a decent chance that if the request doesn't come from a constituent, the request might not even be read. And I just want to emphasize that all offices do handle, appropriations requests differently. And so this is just my perspective coming from one office. But with that, I'm going to stop there. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the appropriations process or my experience in a congressional office navigating the process. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Louis. That is so much to digest. But I hope all of us feel a little bit more ready to take it on. So I do see some questions in our Q&A section. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and take Louis off the spotlight here so you can see both of us. Awesome. So Matthew asks, I know a little bit about the Congress process, and the largest problem is that the military complex is so embedded in the economies of state and local counties. So Congress people are afraid to reduce military budgets because it might upset their local economies, including military bases and weapons industries. So what can we do about that stumbling block?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion, and why I think having trying to spread the word about how the appropriations process works to as many people as possible can help fix that problem. Because I can tell you from experience, defense contractors will come into your office with a slickly produced pamphlet that shows how much money is being spent in your district, in your state, and how many jobs that's creating. And that's a really hard thing to overcome for advocates. And one of the things that I know that the nuclear or anti-nuclear weapons community has been working on is trying to prove that those numbers are inflated and are kind of made up, to be completely honest. And so my view is that if we can get more constituent interest opposing those policies instead, because right now these people, the congressional staff, are really only hearing one side of the argument, and they don't really have a way to disprove or sort of push back on that. And so to the extent that we can really push back on that narrative and make sure that we're reaching all of these offices is the best way I can think about it. I know it's not that satisfying, but I think that's kind of the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and I think we can also talk about the pivoting to a greener recovery, something like a Green New Deal, The jobs in nuclear weapons manufacturing they're for a select few, right? There's that. There's also a lot of places where they cause a vacuum effect because they're jobs that only exist for a decade or so, and then they don't exist in that area anymore. We see that happen by the Savannah River site in Georgia and South Carolina. Um, so I think what we can also do is really focus on the intersections of these issues with all of the other issues that we care about, right? Because yes, they are bringing some jobs to the area, but those jobs could serve the community and the people who are in those positions better as well. Awesome. So, and I see that kind of also answered one of Alan's questions as well. He asked, what serious efforts are there for economic conversion to ensure that workers and communities will not lose from nuclear weapons budget cuts?
Yeah, I mean,
Something to say, Louis.
well, no, I was just going to agree that I do think the sort of pivoting to the, benefits of, green recovery and, the fact that defense spending isn't the only federal funding that creates jobs in communities. And I think that's going to be there are some, I know that there are some members of Congress who are sympathetic to that view, but the challenge is, making sure that there are more.
For sure. So we do have another question from John. So what about changing what goes into the bills in the first place instead of working within the confines of bills being presented? How do we seize the initiative instead of reacting to what Congress does? And I love this question because this is exactly what we need to be doing. So I'm assuming that most people on here are signed up for Beyond the Bombs emails. We did send out an action recently to people in certain districts about appropriations requests, but I'll let Louis talk more about how we can kind of seize that opportunity.
Yeah, so this is exactly what the sort of appropriations request sort of process is all about. This is, if members of Congress are hearing from, constituents and other interest groups, other than the defense contractors, that we don't want to spend $264 billion on the GBSD. Instead we want that to go to renewable energy or education or whatever. That's where you can sort of plug into that process. And so members often have appropriations request forms and on their websites. And that's really the place where you have an opportunity to request and change what goes into those bills in the first place. As I mentioned before, even though the president's budget doesn't have the force of law, that really is the basis from which a lot of the funding and congressional decision-making comes from. And it's a lot harder to influence the presidential budget process. But constituents and citizens do have the power to make their request of their congressional representatives to do so.
Awesome. On that note, I have another question, and I apologize, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, Odile. But Odile asks, can the president have an effect on changing the military budget, doing things like moving it towards infrastructure or other priorities?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the biggest sort of tools of the president's budget is the agenda setting sort of prerogative. And a lot of times, members of Congress, if they see the president, advocating for budget cuts to the Pentagon or to the nuclear weapons budget, they'll be more likely to support that. I'm thinking more in terms of the sort of rank and file, moderate, Democrats who don't necessarily, have opinions on it one way or the other. They want to back up the president, and the president's budget is a way for them to sort of show support without, sticking their neck out too far. And so, yeah, I think it's really more of that agenda setting, and that's you know, the Biden administration has been pushed from a lot of folks in the community to reduce the Pentagon budget, to reduce the nuclear weapons budget, reconsider some of these weapons programs that are unnecessary, dangerous, and a waste of money. And so it's a little more difficult. That process is even less transparent than Congress, which is hard to believe. But there has been work going into that as well.
For sure. And again, just to remind everybody, if you do want to get involved more in this, we send out specific emails to people when they're in a district where you can be effective. So like right now at the point in the process where we're at, if you're on our list, you got an email recently asking you to fill out a form. So that's like the best way to stay on top of how you can have an impact, because, you know, at least personally speaking, I've been doing this for 2 years, like almost 3 years now, and I still feel really lost. It's a really hard process to keep up with, and I do this all day. So we try and make it as easy as possible for you to take action at a time when it is going to be most important. So I have a question from Kathan, and I'm friends with Kathan, so I'm going to rephrase his question a little bit, because he asks how effective Beyond the Bombs efforts have been to outweigh pro-nuke lobbyists. But can we talk about how activists' efforts have worked in the past to push members of Congress to move on defense spending? Is there any examples that come to mind for you?
Well, a recent one that I can think of is, the years have blurred together, but I think it was 2 years ago when President Trump initiated the low yield submarine launched ballistic missile, the W-76-2. Congress, the House rejected that. And that was due in no small part to the robust and loud and active advocacy community that is fueled by a lot of times grassroots energy and interest. And I think it's going to be harder when it's not the sort of Trump boogeyman that is like really easy to organize against. And that's going to, I think that poses a challenge for advocates across the board on, not just nuclear weapons issues, but, everything. But I think that is an example of how, enough organized action can push the House of Representatives to do the right thing.
Yeah, definitely. If you are on this call and you've been in the bomb squad and organizing with us for a little bit, you probably remember getting emails about taking action against low yield nuclear weapons. And it was a really good win for us. I think on that note, something to point out as well is like a lot of these contracts go to only one manufacturer. There's very little competition on them. So the more we can kill these programs before they kind of get their legs, the better. And that's what we're trying to do with the sea-launched cruise missiles and the ground-based strategic defense modernization. So we have about 10 minutes left here, and I do see questions coming in the chat as well, and I apologize, those are a little bit harder for me to keep track of. But Cheryl asks, is much of an appropriation bill a carryover from the previous year? Like how much of this is original work every year?
That's a good question, and it kind of depends on the program and project. Like this gets into some of the like technical and like legal requirements about like outlays and sort of the budget process sort of has like forecasts, and so they're not sort of starting from scratch every year, but they do revisit a lot of programs of record. And so it's kind of a mix of carryover and new things. One thing I will say about sort of continuing resolutions, which are the stopgap funding, those are 100% carryover. And that means that there cannot be any sort of new start projects. So if there's a new program in an appropriations bill, that cannot get started during a continuing resolution. And I will say this is sort of where the authorization and the appropriations bills sort of mix, because a lot of times authorization bills have a certain period under which a program or project is authorized, and that gives the funding authorization. So if there's a bill that says this program is authorized for 5 years, that means there's an appropriations line item for that program for 5 years. And if the bill or the program is not reauthorized, then the budget authority for that program goes away. Those programs can still be funded, but it's frowned upon, even though it does happen.
You're very helpful. So Mary Beth asks a twofold question, and I can answer the first one. Are members of Congress still refusing to meet with their constituents? I think it really depends on your member of Congress. For the most part, all members are doing virtual visits with their representatives or with their constituents. And that's something that we are super happy to help you set up at Beyond the Bomb if you want to do that. You can do it, just like you're at home right now on the Zoom call. That's how a lot of these lobby visits are going. That said, there are still representatives who would rather have their teeth pulled out than sit in a meeting with their constituents. I think you probably know if you're in one of those districts. Another thing to think about is meeting with a staff member is not the worst thing in the world. Honestly, if you can sit down with the staff member that is in charge of talking to your rep about these issues, that can be just as impactful, and you're probably more likely to get more of their time to talk about your issues. But Mary Beth's second question is, are bills still being written by special interest groups? So can you tell us a little bit about that issue?
So I will say that pretty much I don't want to say every bill because that's an exaggeration, but just about every bill is going to get feedback or portions are written by a special interest group, regardless, that's literally any special interest group, whether that's Planned Parenthood, League of Conservation Voters, Oxfam, or on the more nefarious side, defense contractors, those types of groups. So like congressional staff rely on special interest groups for, as a resource and feedback for a lot of things. It's also up to the congressional staff and the member of Congress to do their due diligence to make sure that these are not like out what they're writing is not so far out of the realm of like the norms that it is detrimental and is essentially just a kickback. So it is an issue. But it's kind of an issue across the board, both on sort of issues that I would, be an advocate for, as well as, some of the less productive ones as well.
Cool. So Adrian asks, and feel free to put it in the chat, Adrian, if you have a specific question about them. Adrian asks if you can explain policy riders a little bit more.
Sure. So policy riders, it's, even though the appropriations bills are theoretically only funding bills, there's a lot of policy that gets written into those bills. Most of the time, they're not, necessarily carrying the force of law. It's usually sort of directing agencies to sort of carry out a specific program or project in a certain manner. It sort of provides an oversight function, or just sort of set report language. I've seen report language in bills that literally says the committee is concerned that the State Department isn't carrying this out effectively. Like it's basically like a slap on the wrist. But other times the policy riders can be about preventing funding to carry out certain programs. And that, as I said, that happened with Trump with, there's a big fight in Congress over the border wall funding. So prohibiting funding for the border wall is considered a policy rider because it's sort of, projecting policy through a spending bill. Is that sort of what you had in mind?
So I don't see a follow-up from Adrian, but
if it comes in, I can address it.
Awesome. Since we are running low on time, though, I think we'll wrap it up here. So thank you so much for joining us for this, Louis. If you did not make it here for the entire webinar, we will be posting this to our YouTube. It's available on our Facebook page. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at Tristan@beyondthebomb.org. Louis, do you want to share your email? I'm not sure. And you can encourage the fan mail if you'd like.
Yeah, of course. No, if anyone has any follow-ups or questions, I'm more than happy to take the time to respond to them or chat. I'll type my email into the chat. It's just louis@fp4america.org.
Awesome. So I hope everybody is leaving here feeling like they have a little bit more agency over this process, or at least you are angry enough to want to do something about it. So keep your eyes peeled. We will be reaching out to you with opportunities as they arise. And as more bills get introduced to this new Congress, we will be reaching out to you with opportunities to take action on those as well. So thank you for being here once again, Louis. Thank you to Yasmin for putting this together. And we will see you all soon at our next webinar. We have a wonderful
Thank you all.